What if the truth got you punished instead of praised? When a young farm boy dared to challenge his teacher's outdated lesson, he was humiliated, suspended, and labeled a troublemaker. But the school had no idea who was coming to stand up for him, until the sound of a helicopter echoed over the football field. What happened next left the entire town speechless. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support keeps us going and allows us to bring you more powerful stories like this. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon when Ethan Carter stepped off the worn wooden porch of his family's farmhouse. The cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth, mingled with the distant hum of cattle and the rustling of cornfields. It was a familiar rhythm, one that shaped his every morning before school. Ethan had always been different from the other kids in Magnolia Ridge. While they spent their weekends glued to video games or hanging out at the local diner, he was up before dawn helping his father and grandfather tend to the farm. He could tell when rain was coming just by feeling the shift in the wind. He knew how to rotate crops to keep the soil healthy and had even started experimenting with precision farming techniques, something he had researched online when he wasn't out in the fields. But none of that mattered in the town's school system. In Magnolia Ridge, a boy from a farm was just that, someone who got their hands dirty. Not someone meant to be taken seriously. Ethan knew it, and he had learned to keep his head down. It was easier that way. That morning, as he slid into his seat in Mr. Jacob Whitmore's 7th grade science class, the weight of unspoken expectations pressed on him. Mr. Whitmore was one of the older teachers, a man set in his ways. He was respected, maybe even feared a little, because he didn't tolerate disruptions. His word was final, and no one questioned what was in the textbook. The classroom buzzed with chatter as students settled in. The faint scent of chalk dust lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of floor polish. Ethan flipped through his notebook, already knowing what was coming. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "All right, class. Today, we're discussing modern and traditional farming methods. Turn to page 74. Ethan's eyes skimmed the printed words. The moment he read them, his stomach twisted. The section on crop rotation was outdated. The paragraph on irrigation left out critical advancements. The claim that small farms were disappearing entirely? That wasn't true. His family was proof of that. The lesson carried on, but the words felt heavier with each passing minute. Mr. Whitmore paced the front of the classroom, his voice steady. Farming has changed drastically over the years. Traditional methods are becoming obsolete. Large corporations are now responsible for most food production, leaving small farms struggling to survive. Ethan's hand shot up before he could stop himself. A few students glanced at him. Some smirked. Others exchanged amused glances, already sensing trouble. Mr. Whitmore raised a brow. "Yes, Ethan?" Ethan sat up straighter. "That's not exactly true. Small farms aren't disappearing. They're adapting. We use GPS-guided tractors, soil sensors, and drones for precision farming. And crop rotation? It's not outdated, it's more important now than ever." A hush fell over the classroom. A few students stifled laughter, waiting to see how this would play out. Mr. Whitmore's expression tightened. "Are you questioning the textbook?" Ethan hesitated, but then he nodded. "Yes, sir. The information is wrong." Silence. Then, a low chuckle from the teacher. It wasn't warm. It was dismissive. "Well, I appreciate your enthusiasm, Ethan, but I think I'll trust the experts who wrote this curriculum over a 7th grader from a farm." A few students snickered. Ethan clenched his fists under his desk. He could let it go. He could nod, stay quiet, and move on. But something in him refused. "But the textbook doesn't match what's actually happening. My family's been farming for generations. And we..." Mr. Whitmore cut him off with a wave of his hand. His smile faded, replaced by something colder. "This class follows the curriculum. If you have concerns, you can discuss them after class." Ethan felt heat rise to his face. "So we're just supposed to copy wrong answers?" A few kids gasped under their breath. One or two chuckled, as if entertained by the unfolding scene. Mr. Whitmore's voice dropped, sharp and clipped. "You're being disruptive, Ethan. If you can't respect this class, you can leave." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just telling the truth. But Mr. Whitmore had already made up his mind. Office. Now. The room seemed to shrink. Ethan slowly gathered his notebook and slid out of his seat, his movements stiff. As he walked toward the door, the weight of 100 eyes burned into his back. Some students looked away, not wanting to be associated with him. Others still wore smirks, as if entertained by his downfall. But what stung the most was the silence. No one spoke up. No one said, "He's right." They all just let it happen. Ethan clenched his fists as he stepped into the empty hallway. The classroom door clicked shut behind him, sealing him off from the world he had just left. For the first time, he didn't just feel like a kid from the farm. He felt small. The hallway outside the classroom was quiet except for the distant hum of students chatting in their own little worlds. Ethan stood there for a moment, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on his chest. His fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to turn back, to say something, anything, but the door behind him had already shut, sealing off any chance of that. A deep breath didn't help. Neither did the thought of brushing it off. His stomach twisted as he started down the hall toward the principal's office, each step echoing louder than it should have. By the time he reached the front office, the secretary barely looked up from her desk. Mrs. Dunbar, a woman who had been working there longer than most of the teachers, tapped her nails against the keyboard as she glanced at him over her glasses. "Mr. Whitmore already called ahead," she said, nodding toward the wooden chair against the wall. "Sit tight." Ethan sat, gripping his backpack strap. His knee bounced, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. A few minutes passed. Maybe more. He wasn't sure. Then the door to the principal's office creaked open. Principal Harrison Eastwood stood there, his expression unreadable. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of presence that demanded authority without having to raise his voice. He gestured inside. "Come in, Ethan." The office smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and old books. The windows were drawn, casting the room in dim light despite the bright day outside. Eastwood took his seat behind a wide oak desk, folding his hands in front of him. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Ethan," he began, his voice slow, measured. "I'm trying to understand what happened." Ethan sat straighter. "I corrected something in the textbook, sir. It was wrong." Eastwood let out a low sigh, rubbing his temple as if this conversation had already exhausted him. "I see," he said, "and instead of waiting to discuss it after class, you chose to challenge your teacher in front of everyone?" Ethan frowned. "I wasn't challenging him. I was just..." Eastwood held up a hand. "Ethan, listen to me. It's not about whether you were right or wrong." That made Ethan pause. The principal leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's about respect. There is a way to handle disagreements. A way to show maturity." He gave a small shrug. "You chose the wrong way." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't raise my voice. I wasn't rude," he said carefully. "I just pointed out something that wasn't true." Eastwood exhaled, drumming his fingers lightly on the desk. "Look, son, I get it. You come from a hard-working family. You've probably learned things out on the farm that aren't in the curriculum. But this isn't about your farm, Ethan. It's about structure, about following the rules." Ethan stared at him. "Even if the rules are wrong?" A flicker of irritation crossed Eastwood's face. "This conversation isn't going anywhere," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I have no reason to believe Mr. Whitmore was trying to embarrass you. But he felt you were disruptive. That's the issue here." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had expected an argument, maybe even a scolding. He hadn't expected this. So that was it? Not about what's right or wrong. Just about keeping order. Eastwood straightened, reaching for a slip of paper on his desk. "I'm suspending you for the day, Ethan," he said. "We'll discuss further action tomorrow." Ethan's stomach dropped. "That's not fair," he said, his voice firmer now. Eastwood gave a tight smile, as if he had heard it all before. "It's not about fair," he said. "It's about keeping the school running the way it's supposed to." A sharp silence followed. Ethan could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant ringing of the final bell. The decision was made. By the time his mother arrived to pick him up, the tension in the air was thick. Tasha Carter walked in with the kind of calm that only came from years of knowing how the world worked. She didn't argue, didn't protest, just nodded as Eastwood explained what had happened. Ethan sat there, waiting for her to fight back, to say something, anything, but she didn't. And somehow, that silence hurt more than the suspension. They walked out of the office, through the hallway where students lingered at their lockers. Some of them glanced at Ethan with curiosity. Others smirked. One whispered something to a friend, and they both laughed. Ethan kept his head down. As he stepped outside, his mother's voice finally broke the silence. "You want to tell me why I had to leave work for this?" Ethan stared straight ahead. "I told the truth." His mother let out a slow breath. "And look where that got you." The car ride home was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the tires against the road. But the real storm was waiting at the farm. Because when they pulled into the driveway, Ethan's father, Mark Carter, was already standing on the porch, arms crossed, and next to him, leaning against the wooden railing, was the one person who never let injustice slide. Ezekiel Carter, Ethan's grandfather. His 6'4" frame cast a long shadow, his silver beard trimmed sharp. He was dressed in his usual dark jeans and button-up shirt, looking every bit the man who had built his farm from the ground up. He didn't say anything at first, just studied Ethan, his eyes sharp, unreadable. Then, in a voice low and steady, he finally spoke. "They suspended you," he said. Ethan swallowed. "Yeah." Ezekiel nodded slowly, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "They want to send my grandson home," he said. "Fine, we'll send them a message." Ethan wasn't sure what he meant. But by the next morning, no one at Magnolia Ridge Middle School would forget the name Ezekiel Carter. Ethan woke up before sunrise, the way he always did. But today, instead of heading to the barn or checking the irrigation lines with his dad, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a piece of toast that had gone cold. The weight of what had happened yesterday still pressed on his chest. His suspension was only for a day, but the damage had already been done. He could feel it in the way his mother avoided eye contact as she packed his lunch. He could see it in the way his father stirred his coffee without speaking. "You sure you want to go back there today?" Mark Carter finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because he refused to be pushed out. Maybe because, despite everything, he still believed that telling the truth should matter. His mother, Sarah, let out a slow breath. "Just keep your head down, Ethan, please. We don't need more trouble." Ezekiel, his grandfather, chuckled from across the table. He hadn't said much since Ethan got home the day before. Just listened. But now, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "He's not the one looking for trouble," Ezekiel said. "He just happened to be in the way when it came knocking." His father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Doesn't mean he has to stand there and take every hit." Ezekiel smirked but didn't argue. He just gave Ethan a long look before pushing back from the table. "Go on, then. Let's see what they've got waiting for you." The ride to school was quiet, except for the low hum of country radio in the background. When they pulled up to the front, Ethan could already feel the stares. As soon as he stepped through the doors, it was clear. Things had changed. Some kids muttered as he walked by, their voices just loud enough to make sure he heard them. "Look who's back. Think he'll argue with the teacher again? Bet he lasts a week before they kick him out for good." He didn't react. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Jordan, his closest friend, caught up to him near his locker. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Man, you really pissed off Whitmore," Jordan said, glancing around like he was making sure no one heard him. "People are saying he's got it out for you now." Ethan shoved his books into his bag. "Guess I'll find out soon enough." Jordan hesitated. Maybe you should just let it go. Lay low for a while." Ethan turned to look at him, searching his face. "So that's it? I was right, but because it made him mad, I should just pretend it didn't happen?" Jordan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. "They're never gonna let you win, Ethan." Ethan felt a flicker of something in his chest. Anger, frustration, maybe even doubt. But before he could respond, the first bell rang. He squared his shoulders and headed to class. When he walked into Mr. Whitmore's room, the teacher didn't even acknowledge him at first. just continued writing on the board as if Ethan wasn't there. But the moment class started, it became obvious that Whitmore hadn't forgotten a thing. "We're starting presentations today," Whitmore announced, turning to face the room. "Your assigned topics are based on modern agricultural practices. Each of you will explain how these methods have changed farming." Ethan's stomach tightened. Whitmore's eyes flicked to him, just for a second, before he continued, "I'll be grading on accuracy, sources, and, most importantly, your ability to respect established knowledge." A couple of students chuckled under their breath. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what this was. His name was called second. There was no time to prepare, no time to get his bearings. He grabbed his notes, stood up, and walked to the front of the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had spent years learning about farming, not from books, but from experience. He had seen firsthand how small farms adapted, how technology had transformed the industry. He knew this subject better than anyone in that room, including Whitmore. So he started talking. He explained how precision agriculture allowed farmers to use data to maximize yield while conserving resources. He described GPS-guided tractors, which reduced waste, and soil sensors, which ensured crops got exactly the nutrients they needed. He even pulled out statistics, real-world examples from farming communities, studies he had looked up on his own time. For a moment, just a moment, the room was silent. Then Whitmore spoke. "Interesting," he said, his tone flat. "And where exactly did you find this information?" Ethan frowned. "I researched." Whitmore held up a hand. "Let me clarify. Which peer-reviewed academic sources did you cite?" Ethan hesitated. The truth was, most of what he knew came from real-world experience, trade articles, and interviews with actual farmers, not traditional textbooks. Whitmore smirked, as if he had been waiting for that. "So, no legitimate sources?" Ethan gritted his teeth. "They're legitimate. Just because they aren't in a textbook doesn't mean." "But that's the issue, isn't it?" Whitmore cut in smoothly. "This is a classroom. We rely on factual, academic sources, not anecdotes." Ethan's fingers curled into his palm. "So, actual experience doesn't count? Not if it isn't backed by real science." The words hung in the air, deliberate, final. Whitmore turned to the class. "This is why we follow structured research. Everyone. Because otherwise, anyone can claim to be an expert." Laughter rippled through the room. Ethan's face burned. He looked at the students, saw the smirks, the pitying glances. Whitmore leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Thank you, Ethan. You may sit." Ethan's hands tightened at his sides. Every part of him screamed to argue, to fight back. But what was the point? The system was rigged. So, he sat. Whitmore moved on without another word. But Ethan barely heard the next presentation. He just kept replaying the moment over and over. Had he lost? Had they won? And then, the worst thought of all. Did it even matter? Ethan sat outside the principal's office, the air thick with the faint scent of floor polish and old paper. The chair beneath him felt stiff, unwelcoming, like it was designed to make students uncomfortable. His knee bounced involuntarily as he stared at the closed door in front of him. Waiting. It wasn't the first time he'd sat here. But this time felt different. This time, it wasn't because he had done something wrong. This time, he was here because he refused to back down. The secretary barely glanced at him as she tapped away on her keyboard. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second dragging longer than the last. Finally, the door creaked open. Principal Harrison Eastwood stood there, his face calm, unreadable. He gestured for Ethan to enter. The office was dimly lit, the blinds partially drawn. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with textbooks and binders labeled with years of school records. A framed diploma hung behind the desk, but Ethan's eyes were drawn to the small brass nameplate that sat in the center. It felt like a reminder of authority, of finality. Eastwood settled into his chair, folding his hands in front of him. He didn't say anything right away, just studied Ethan as if deciding how much patience he was willing to extend. "Ethan," he said finally, his tone measured, "what can I do for you?" Ethan took a breath, steadying himself. "I want to appeal my grade on the presentation." A flicker of something crossed Eastwood's face. Boredom. Maybe. Or mild amusement. He exhaled. rubbing his chin. I see. Ethan pressed forward. I spent time researching. I used real-world examples. I backed up everything I said. But Mr. Whitmore, Eastwood held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something quieter. Something final. Ethan, I need you to understand something. Ethan braced himself. This isn't about whether you're right or wrong. A cold feeling crept into Ethan's chest. Eastwood sighed, as if he were explaining something obvious. It's about respecting the structure of the system. The world isn't always fair. You don't always get credit just because you think you deserve it. Ethan's hands curled into fists under the desk. But Eastwood shook his head. This is a school. There are rules, expectations, and one of those expectations is that students learn how to operate within the system. Not against it. He let the words settle before continuing. I know this feels unfair. I get that, but my advice? Accept it. Move on. Ethan stared at him, feeling something sharp twist in his chest. That was it. No reconsideration, no discussion. Just accept it. Eastwood exhaled, sitting back in his chair. I don't want to see you in here again for something like this. Ethan swallowed the words burning in his throat. He nodded stiffly, pushing himself up from the chair. The conversation was over. As he walked out, the weight in his chest only grew heavier. By the time he reached the hallway, the stares had started again. Some students smirked, whispering under their breath. Others just glanced at him and looked away, not wanting to be associated with him. He had been marked, labeled as the kid who made trouble. Jordan caught up to him near the lockers, shifting uncomfortably. You went to Eastwood? Jordan asked, his voice low. Ethan didn't answer right away. Jordan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. And? Ethan clenched his jaw. He told me to accept it. Jordan gave him a knowing look. Yeah, that's what they do. Ethan shook his head. It's not right. Jordan sighed. It doesn't matter if it's right. It's just how it is. Something inside Ethan snapped. So what? We're just supposed to let them do whatever they want? Pretend like the truth doesn't matter? Jordan's expression darkened. Ethan, you don't get it. This isn't a fight you can win. People like Whitmore, like Eastwood, they've been running things forever. You're not gonna change that. Ethan opened his mouth, but Jordan was already shaking his head. Just let it go, man. Ethan watched as Jordan turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone. Maybe that was the worst part. Not just the punishment, but the way everyone accepted it. When he got home, the house was quiet. His mother was still at work. His father was out in the fields. But Ezekiel sat on the front porch, sipping black coffee from a tin mug. He didn't say anything as Ethan dropped his backpack by the door and sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustling of the cornfields in the wind. Then Ezekiel finally spoke, his voice steady. You know what separates winners from losers? Ethan stared at the horizon. What? Ezekiel set his mug down on the wooden railing. It's not talent, not luck. He turned to look at Ethan. It's who gets back up. Ethan swallowed. Ezekiel studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the fields. Your great-grandfather, he lost half his crops one year. Drought came early. He could have packed up, left town, said it was over. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But he didn't. He started over. And you know what happened the next year? Ethan shook his head. Ezekiel's lips curled into a small smirk. He had the best harvest of his life. Ethan thought about that for a long moment. This wasn't just about a grade. It wasn't just about a presentation. It was about something bigger. And he wasn't ready to quit. The house was quieter than usual that evening. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, thick with words left unsaid. Ethan sat at the dinner table, pushing a piece of cornbread around his plate, barely touching his food. Across from him, his mother was watching him carefully, her fork motionless against her plate. Mark Carter sat at the head of the table, eyes fixed on his food, eating in silence. It was the same silence he had carried since Ethan's suspension, since the confrontation with Whitmore. He hadn't scolded Ethan, hadn't encouraged him either. He just let things be. And that, more than anything, hurt. Ezekiel sat at the other end, his usual presence filling the room, his back straight, his weathered hands resting on the table, his eyes sharp as ever. He hadn't said much since Ethan came home. But something about the way he watched the boy made it clear, he was waiting. Sarah sighed, setting her fork down. Ethan, listen to me. Her voice was softer than usual, almost pleading. You don't have to fight this battle. You don't have to carry all of this on your own. Ethan kept his gaze down, staring at his plate. His mother continued, I know this feels unfair. I know you think you're standing up for something important. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? There are things in life we just have to let go of. Ethan clenched his jaw, a bitter taste rising in his throat. So I should just do nothing? His voice was quieter than he expected. Sarah exhaled. I'm saying, sometimes the best thing to do is keep your head down and move on. You can't fix everything, Ethan. The words sat between them, cold and sharp. Then Ezekiel set his fork down with a deliberate clink. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just rested his hands on the table, studying Ethan, then his mother, then Mark, who still hadn't looked up. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. Ethan, he said, his voice steady, deep, carrying the weight of years behind it. Let me tell you a story. The air shifted. Sarah straightened slightly. Even Mark stopped eating, his shoulders tensing just a little. Ezekiel took a slow breath. When I was about your age, I had a teacher a lot like Whitmore. A man who believed some folks had a right to speak, and others had a right to listen. Nothing more. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, as if pulling the memory from a place he hadn't touched in a long time. One day, he told me I wasn't smart enough to learn mathematics. Said I should focus on something more practical, like working with my hands, because that was all someone like me was ever going to do. Ethan swallowed. I knew he was wrong. Ezekiel continued. I knew I could do the same work as anyone else. But when I tried to prove it, he made sure I failed. Gave me the lowest grade he could. Told the class 1 was an example of what happened when people overstepped their place. A bitter smile pulled at his lips. I could have let it go. I could have walked away. Just like you're being told to do now. His eyes met Ethan's, sharp and unyielding. But I didn't. Ethan barely breathed. Ezekiel sat back slightly, resting his hands in his lap. See, people like Whitmore? They don't want you to fail because they think you're wrong. They want you to fail because they're afraid you're right. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Dad, that's not. Ezekiel lifted a hand, silencing her without a word. His gaze never left Ethan. The only way they win, he said, as if you let them. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it was different, heavier. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, not anger, not frustration, but something deeper. Sarah shook her head, rubbing her temple. I just don't want him to get hurt. Dad. Ezekiel's face softened just a little. Neither do I. Then his voice hardened again. But I'd rather see him fight for something that matters than learn to bow his head before he even gets the chance to stand tall. Ethan took a slow breath. It wasn't just about a grade. It wasn't just about a presentation. It was about who he was going to be. He pushed his plate away, his appetite gone, but for the first time in days, there was no hesitation in his chest. I'm not done, he said quietly. Ezekiel smiled, just a small, knowing smile. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. Mark finally looked up, his expression unreadable. But it didn't matter, because Ethan had made up his mind. Ethan knew one thing for certain. Arguing wasn't going to be enough. He had learned that the hard way. No matter how right he was, no matter how much evidence he had in his head, the system would always find a way to shut him down. But if there was one thing his grandfather had taught him, it was this. Truth wasn't just about knowing. It was about proving. And if he was going to change anything, he needed proof. That night, while the rest of the house settled into its usual routine, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at an empty notebook. His mind raced, piecing together everything that had happened. He thought about the tests where answers had been marked wrong even when they were right. He thought about the way Whitmore dismissed students who weren't part of his favorites. He thought about the other kids who had gone through this before him and never fought back. A plan began to take shape. First, he needed evidence. He dug through his old assignments, flipping through pages of red marks and comments that didn't add up. He snapped photos of his tests, noting every questionable deduction. Then he started collecting stories. Quiet conversations with students who had been ignored, dismissed, or humiliated. Some were hesitant, but most had the same look in their eyes, a flicker of recognition. A silent understanding that they weren't alone. At school, he paid closer attention to every detail, every offhand remark, every instance where Whitmore dismissed a student's answer before they even finished speaking. And then, one afternoon, when the classroom was nearly empty, he made his move. As he packed his bag, he slipped his phone into his hoodie pocket. Pressing record, Whitmore stood at his desk, grading papers, occasionally sighing in irritation. Ethan hesitated just a moment before speaking. "Mr. Whitmore, can I ask something?" The teacher barely looked up. "Make it quick, Carter." Ethan swallowed. "Why did I get marked down for my sources when I cited real-world data? Shouldn't hands-on experience count for something?" Whitmore scoffed, flipping a page. "I don't have time for this discussion again. You were marked down because you didn't follow proper academic guidelines. What you think is real-world knowledge is just your family's opinion." Ethan felt his fingers tighten around the strap of his backpack. "But the textbook is outdated. The farming industry is changing." Whitmore's eyes flicked up, sharp. "The textbook is the curriculum. You don't get to decide what's right and wrong in my class. Carter, that's not how education works." Ethan stayed silent for a beat. Then he nodded and turned toward the door. He didn't need to keep pushing. He already had what he came for. Later that night, he played the recording back, listening carefully. Every word, every dismissive tone. This was what he needed. The next step was bigger. He couldn't do it alone. It was Jordan who found him first. Ethan was sitting outside the school, flipping through his notes when Jordan dropped into the seat next to him. "You really aren't letting this go, huh?" Ethan glanced up. "Did you think I would?" Jordan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought you'd get tired of banging your head against a brick wall." "But," he hesitated, "I heard what Whitmore did to you during the presentation. That wasn't just unfair, man. That was personal." Ethan nodded. "It's not just me, Jordan. This has been happening for years. And it's not just him. It's the way this whole place works. They don't want us to think for ourselves." Jordan was quiet for a long time. Then he let out a slow breath. "So, what's the plan?" Ethan smirked. "I was hoping you'd ask." The next few days, things started shifting. Ethan and Jordan worked quietly, gathering testimonies from students who had been overlooked, ridiculed, or unfairly graded. Some were reluctant, too afraid of retaliation, but others were tired of being ignored. Word spread, quietly at first, like a rumor whispered from locker to locker, and then louder. Whitmore noticed. Ethan could see it in the way his teacher's eyes lingered on him longer than usual, in the way his voice grew sharper, his patience thinner. It wasn't outright panic, but it was close. Then, one morning, Principal Eastwood called Ethan into his office. Ethan walked in, head high, heart steady. He already knew what was coming. Eastwood sighed as he sat behind his desk, his fingers laced together. "Ethan, I'm going to give you a piece of advice. One that I strongly suggest you take." Ethan stayed silent. Eastwood's voice lowered. "You're getting dangerously close to making things worse for yourself. I suggest you stop." Ethan didn't flinch. "Or what?" Eastwood's jaw tightened. "This isn't about threats, Ethan. This is about knowing when to pick your battles. I understand that you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not going to change the way things work here." Ethan met his gaze. "Maybe not, but I'm still going to try." For the first time, Eastwood looked unsure. Ethan didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just turned and walked out, his chest tight with something new. For the first time since this had started, he wasn't just reacting, he was leading, and they were starting to notice. Ethan sensed it before it even happened. The way Whitmore's eyes lingered on him a little too long during class. The hushed conversations between the teachers in the hallway. The way students who had started whispering about standing up for themselves suddenly went quiet when he walked by. Something was coming. And when Whitmore called for a surprise exam the next morning, Ethan knew exactly what it was. He sat at his desk, his heartbeat steady but alert, watching as the test papers were passed around. The classroom was silent, the weight of expectation heavy in the air. When the paper landed on his desk, he read the first question, and his stomach dropped. This wasn't just any exam. The questions had nothing to do with the material they had been covering. They weren't about modern agricultural methods or technological advancements in farming. Instead, the questions were twisted, worded in a way that made even the most basic answers impossible. Some were outright false, designed to make him contradict himself. Others referenced outdated techniques that hadn't been used in decades. It wasn't just a test. It was a setup. Whitmore stood at the front of the class, arms crossed, watching, waiting. Ethan swallowed, gripping his pencil tighter. Stay calm. Think. He could try to answer them the way Whitmore wanted. Play the game. Pretend he didn't notice. But even that wasn't an option. The way the questions were designed, no matter what he wrote, he'd be wrong. He glanced around the room. Some students were already looking at him. Their expressions mixed, a few with sympathy, a few with amusement, most with indifference. Whitmore smirked. You have 30 minutes, he announced, tapping his watch. Do your best. Ethan's pulse pounded. He had two choices. Take the test, fail deliberately, and let Whitmore prove his point. Or refuse. He stared at the paper. Then exhaled slowly. Then, without hesitation, he put his pencil down. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Something wrong, Carter? Ethan met his gaze head on. Yeah, this test is garbage. A few students sucked in their breath. Someone whispered, "Oh, man." Whitmore's smirk widened, but his eyes were cold. Excuse me? Ethan sat up, pushing the paper forward. These questions aren't real. They're designed to make me fail. Everyone in this room knows it. Whitmore tilted his head. So what are you saying? That you're refusing to take the test? Ethan held his ground. I'm saying this isn't about education. This is about proving a point. Your point. The room went silent. Even the students who usually ignored everything were paying attention now. Whitmore let the silence drag before shaking his head in mock disappointment. You know, Carter, I was hoping you'd finally learn something in my class. But I guess some people just don't want to be educated. He turned to the class. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a perfect example of what happens when arrogance replaces discipline. When students think they know more than their teachers. He grabbed Ethan's paper and held it up. Ethan Carter has officially refused to take the exam. And that, according to school policy, is considered academic dishonesty. Ethan's stomach tightened. Whitmore turned to the door. I think Principal Eastwood will be very interested in hearing about this. The words were barely out of his mouth before the door opened. A secretary stepped in, looking at Ethan. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice clipped. The principal needs to see you. Now. A few gasps rippled through the class. Ethan didn't move at first. He turned back to Whitmore, who was watching him with barely concealed satisfaction. There was nothing left to say. He grabbed his bag, stood up, and walked out without another word. By the time he reached the principal's office, the air felt heavier, like the walls had closed in. Principal Eastwood sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Whitmore stood beside him, arms crossed, silent but triumphant. Ethan, Eastwood sighed, gesturing for him to sit. This has gone far enough. Ethan didn't move. This is a setup. Eastwood folded his hands. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. Ethan shot back. It's a fact. The test wasn't real. It was designed to make me fail. Whitmore let out a short laugh. And what proof do you have of that? Ethan clenched his jaw. Eastwood leaned forward. Ethan, we've received multiple reports of you being disruptive in class, refusing to follow guidelines, and now, refusing to participate in academic evaluations. This kind of behavior is what happens when someone won't just roll over and accept a lie. Ethan interrupted. Eastwood's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitmore shook his head. I warned you, Carter. Actions have consequences. The principal pulled a folder from his desk and flipped it open. He barely looked up as he spoke. Ethan Carter, effective immediately. You are suspended indefinitely for violating academic integrity and failing to show proper respect to school faculty. The words rang in Ethan's ears. Suspended, indefinitely. Not just a few days. Not just a week. They were trying to erase him. Eastwood closed the folder. You'll be informed of any further action pending review by the school board. The final nail in the coffin. If the board agreed, He wouldn't be coming back at all. Ethan stared at them, his chest tightening. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was war. Ethan sat in the chair across from Principal Eastwood, his hands resting calmly in his lap. His heart should have been racing. But it wasn't. He had expected this moment. Whitmore stood near the window, arms crossed, his expression a careful mask of confidence. The principal, on the other hand, looked less composed than usual. He was shifting slightly, adjusting the papers on his desk in an attempt to look in control. Ethan knew why. This wasn't just another student getting suspended. This was different. Well, Ethan, Eastwood finally spoke, folding his hands. You've certainly caused quite a disturbance. Ethan met his gaze. I didn't cause anything. I just refused to stay quiet. Whitmore let out a scoff. You refused to follow the rules. And that's why you're sitting here right now. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Are we sure about that? For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Whitmore's face. Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone. He unlocked the screen, tapped a file, and set the device on the desk. Then he hit play. The room filled with Whitmore's own voice. Education isn't about your little opinions, Carter. It's about learning to follow authority. If you don't understand that, you don't belong here. Eastwood's brow furrowed. Ethan pressed another file. This is a school, not some protest ground. You're not here to challenge the system. You're here to obey it. Whitmore's expression darkened. Where did you? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he took out a printed stack of documents, photocopies of his altered test, statements from students who had been unfairly treated, screenshots of messages where students shared their stories. He placed them neatly on Eastwood's desk. The principal looked through the pages, his expression growing heavier with each one. Whitmore, however, was quicker to react. This is ridiculous. A bunch of complaints from students who didn't get the grades they wanted. You think this proves anything? Ethan met his gaze. I think it proves everything. Eastwood let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. He wasn't looking at Whitmore. He was looking at the phone, at the documents, at the weight of something much bigger than just one student's rebellion. Then, before either of them could speak, the phone on Eastwood's desk rang. He hesitated before answering. Yes? Ethan didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation, because he had already made sure they did. By the time he walked into that office, the recordings, the documents, the entire story had already spread beyond the school walls. Students had shared it online. Parents had started calling the district. A few reporters had even reached out, asking questions about allegations of academic misconduct and student mistreatment. Ethan hadn't needed to wait for justice to come to him. He had taken it into his own hands. Eastwood set the phone down slowly. His face was pale. The district board wants a full review. Whitmore's jaw tightened. You can't be serious. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Oh, he's serious. Silence stretched between them. Then the door opened again. Ezekiel Carter stepped inside. The energy in the room shifted immediately. The old man walked in like he had all the time in the world, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his expression unreadable. Eastwood stiffened. Mr. Carter. Not now, son, Ezekiel said, his voice calm but firm. He took one glance at the papers on the desk, the phone still open with its recordings, and then looked directly at Whitmore. I believe the boy has made his point. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak. Ezekiel turned his gaze to Eastwood. So tell me, principal, what happens now? Eastwood cleared his throat, but the usual authority in his voice was gone. We will, of course, conduct an internal review. The board will. Ezekiel nodded once. Good, because if you don't act fast, the public will. Eastwood swallowed. Ezekiel leaned forward just slightly, enough that the air in the room felt heavier. You think this is about one boy? It's not. This is about all the kids who walked out of this school thinking they weren't good enough because someone like him, he nodded toward Whitmore, decided they didn't deserve a fair shot. Eastwood said nothing. Ethan sat back in his chair, watching as the weight of reality settled over them. The students knew, the parents knew, the district knew, and suddenly, Whitmore and Eastwood weren't the ones in control anymore. Ezekiel took a step back. Now, I suggest you think long and hard before making your next move. Whitmore exhaled sharply. This is absurd. You're acting like this. This child has somehow. Ethan stood. For the first time in weeks. He wasn't uncertain. He wasn't angry. He was winning. Looks like your rules didn't work this time, Ethan said, meeting Whitmore's eyes one last time before turning toward the door. He didn't need to stay. The battle was already over. The meeting room was packed. Parents filled the chairs. Teachers lined the walls. And at the front of it all, the school board sat behind a long wooden table, their faces carefully neutral. Ethan stood near the back with his grandfather, arms crossed, watching. He had done his part. The evidence was out. The truth was no longer something they could sweep under the rug. Now, it was their move. Principal Eastwood sat stiffly at the table, his usual polished demeanor cracked at the edges. Beside him, Whitmore still carried himself with arrogance, but there was a nervous energy in the way his fingers tapped against the table. He had felt the shift. Everyone had. The chairwoman of the school board, a woman named Margaret Lane, cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. We've reviewed the concerns raised over the past few days. She began, her voice even. We understand that emotions are high, but we need to approach this with fairness and facts. Ethan almost laughed at that. Fairness? Where was that fairness when Whitmore was failing students for challenging him? Where was fairness when Eastwood had tried to silence him instead of addressing the truth? A man in a suit leaned forward. Principal Eastwood, can you explain how this situation escalated? Eastwood shifted. Ethan Carter has a history of questioning authority, he said smoothly. While we encourage healthy debate, his behavior disrupted classroom instruction and created unnecessary division among students and faculty. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. Let them talk. Let them dig their own hole. Lane turned to Whitmore. And Mr. Whitmore, what is your response to the allegations that you altered exam content and unfairly graded students who disagreed with you? Whitmore exhaled, shaking his head. This is being blown out of proportion, he said, his voice full of forced patience. Education requires structure. If students decide they don't have to follow it, what message are we sending? That they can just challenge authority whenever they want? A woman in the audience scoffed. A parent. Are you saying students shouldn't think for themselves? Whitmore gave a tight smile. I'm saying they should trust the people who are trained to educate them. Ethan clenched his fists. That was the core of Whitmore's belief, wasn't it? Obedience over truth, compliance over knowledge. Before the board could move on, a teacher stood up. She was older, with tired eyes and a hesitance in her stance, but her voice was steady. I've worked with Mr. Whitmore for years, she said, and this isn't the first time something like this has happened. The room went still. She swallowed. He has failed students for questioning him before. He has ridiculed them in front of their peers. Many of us have seen it, but no one wanted to risk their own positions to speak up. Whitmore's head snapped toward her. That is a very serious accusation. But it's true, she said simply. A heavy silence filled the room. Then another voice spoke, a parent this time. If my son had been treated like that, how could I trust this school? Then another. My daughter was in his class last year. She never said anything, but she always felt like she wasn't allowed to speak up. More murmurs, more shifting. The system was cracking. Whitmore's face hardened. This is ridiculous. Are we really going to let one student turn this school into chaos? This is about one boy who refused to follow the rules. Ethan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to argue. He just said the truth. If you let this keep happening, I won't be the last. The room was silent. Ethan looked directly at the school board. If you decide to ignore this, then other students will go through the same thing. Maybe they won't speak up. Maybe they'll just take it, because they think no one will believe them. He let the words sink in. Today, it's me. Tomorrow, it could be any one of them. No one spoke. Margaret Lane sat back in her chair, pressing her lips together. We will need to deliberate, she finally said. That was it. No immediate victory. No dramatic reversal of fate. But Ethan could see it. The damage was done. The doubt was planted. Whitmore and Eastwood had lost their control. For the first time, the system wasn't protecting them. For the first time, it was protecting the truth. The boardroom had quieted. The heated arguments had settled, leaving behind a heavy tension that filled the air. Some decisions were already made, yet nothing felt fully resolved. Ethan stood near the doorway, watching as the school board members filed out one by one. Their faces were tight with discomfort, their professional facades barely holding together. They had conceded, but not willingly. He had won a battle. But the war? That was far from over. Margaret Lane, the chairwoman, approached him with a measured look. "Ethan," she said, keeping her voice neutral, "the board has decided to remove the disciplinary actions from your record. You'll be reinstated immediately." Ethan nodded, waiting for the rest. Lane hesitated. "Additionally, Principal Eastwood will receive a formal reprimand for failing to address student concerns appropriately." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "And Whitmore?" Lane exhaled through her nose, shifting uncomfortably. "The board will be launching a full investigation into his conduct. But as of now, he remains in his position." There it was. The one thing they weren't willing to do. Whitmore wasn't being removed, wasn't being held accountable, not yet. Because the system wasn't ready to break itself. Ethan clenched his fists but kept his expression even. He had expected this. They were protecting their own. His grandfather stepped beside him, arms crossed. "That's a mistake," Ezekiel said plainly. "A big one." Lane straightened, meeting his gaze. "We have procedures to follow. Mr. Carter, the board can't make decisions based on pressure alone." Ezekiel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the problem, isn't it? You only act when you have no choice." Lane pursed her lips but said nothing. Ethan didn't wait for more. He turned toward the exit, his steps measured. But just before he reached the door, a voice stopped him. "Do you really think you've won?" Ethan turned. Whitmore stood there, leaning casually against the doorway of a side office. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes? They were dark with barely contained frustration. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the man, seeing him for what he truly was, not an all-powerful authority figure, but a man who had relied on a broken system to keep his power intact. And now, that power was slipping. Whitmore pushed off the doorframe and stepped forward. "You might have stirred things up, Carter, but you haven't changed anything." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying bitterness to it. "The system doesn't bend for one student. You'll be gone in a year, maybe two. And this?" He gestured vaguely to the boardroom. "This will be forgotten." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then smiled, small, knowing. "I don't need to change the system overnight," he said. "I just needed people to start questioning it." Whitmore's face twitched, just for a second. Ethan took a step closer. "You're right about one thing, though," he said, his voice quieter now. "I won't be here forever. But the students who come after me, they won't be so easy to silence anymore." Whitmore's jaw tightened. For the first time, Ethan saw it. The moment of realization. The moment the man understood that he had already lost. Because control wasn't about rules or punishments. It was about belief. And Whitmore no longer had that. Ethan turned, stepping past him without another word. As he walked down the hallway, he felt it. The weight lifting. The certainty settling deep in his chest. He hadn't just fought for himself. He had fought for every kid who would come after him. And no matter what Whitmore or the system tried to do next. The silence had already been broken. The aftermath was impossible to ignore. By the time the school bell rang the next morning, whispers filled the hallways like wildfire. Teachers exchanged cautious glances. Students spoke in hushed voices, retelling the events of the school board meeting like it was the biggest scandal to ever hit their town. Ethan walked through the halls, feeling every set of eyes on him. But it was different this time. The stares weren't mocking or dismissive. They were filled with something else. Recognition and respect. News of the incident had spread beyond the school. Parents were demanding answers, questioning how the administration had allowed things to get so far. Some even showed up at the school, asking for meetings with Principal Eastwood. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. Students who had never dared to speak up before started to share their own experiences. Stories of unfair grading, favoritism, punishments for simply asking questions. The school wasn't just dealing with a single student's rebellion anymore. It was dealing with a reckoning. Whitmore sat at his desk, stiff and composed, but the cracks were starting to show. His authority had been bruised. Students didn't look at him with fear anymore. They weren't whispering behind his back out of intimidation. They were watching, waiting, and that terrified him. A few teachers subtly distanced themselves from him. One even hesitated before greeting him in the lounge, as if afraid of being associated with him now. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be alone. Eastwood fared no better. The school board had announced an internal review of his leadership. He wasn't fired. Not yet. But the power he once wielded had been weakened. He spent most of the day locked in his office, avoiding the growing storm outside. Ethan, however, was just beginning to see the full impact of what had happened. At lunch, Jordan approached him. He had his hands stuffed in his pockets, his usual confident demeanor dimmed by something heavier. "You really did it," he said, shaking his head. "I thought you were going to crash and burn. Man, but you actually made them listen." Ethan didn't respond right away. He wasn't angry at Jordan. He had never expected his friend to fight alongside him. But he did realize something. People always waited until the battle was won before they admitted they should have fought with you. "You don't have to believe in me," Ethan finally said. "You just have to believe that change is possible." Jordan let out a quiet chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I'm starting to." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a declaration of loyalty. But it was enough. Later that afternoon, as Ethan walked to his locker, a younger student hesitated near him. He was probably in 6th grade, clutching his books tightly to his chest. His voice was barely above a whisper. I just wanted to say thanks," the boy murmured. Ethan frowned. "For what?" The kid shifted on his feet, glancing down the hall like he was afraid someone would hear him. "I got in trouble last year for questioning something in class," he admitted. "They told me to just accept what was in the textbook." His grip on his books tightened. I thought I was the only one." Ethan exhaled slowly. This was why he had fought. Not for revenge, not just to prove Whitmore wrong, but for kids like this. "You're not," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You never were." The boy nodded before hurrying away, disappearing into the sea of students. Ethan watched him go, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. For the first time, he understood the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. The school felt different now. It wasn't just in the way teachers glanced at Ethan with newfound caution, or how Principal Eastwood avoided his gaze whenever they crossed paths in the hallway. It was in the students. Something had shifted. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now being spoken aloud. Students who had once accepted unfair treatment as the norm were now questioning it. Ethan had returned to class that morning expecting awkward stares, maybe even hostility. Instead, he found a quiet respect. When he slid into his usual seat, the usual smirks and side comments were absent. A few students nodded at him, a silent acknowledgement of what he had done. Jordan sat beside him, tapping a pen against his notebook before glancing at him. "Feels different, huh?" Ethan gave a small shrug, pretending not to notice. "Maybe." Jordan smirked. "You shook the whole damn place. Man, even the cafeteria ladies are talking about you." Ethan chuckled. "Guess I should start charging for autographs." Then, a ripple of laughter went through their section of the room. But before the moment could stretch too long, the door creaked open. Whitmore walked in. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel his stomach tighten. The teacher's usual air of superiority had faded, replaced with something more careful. He carried himself with the same authority, but his grip on it was weaker. Even the way he set his books down seemed more controlled, as if every move he made was being watched. Because it was. He cleared his throat, glancing at Ethan for the briefest second before turning toward the board. "Open your textbooks," he said, voice stiff. "Page 132. And just like that, class began. But it wasn't the same anymore. Later that afternoon, a special meeting was held in the auditorium. Students and parents filled the seats, murmuring among themselves as the school board took their places on stage. Principal Eastwood addressed the crowd, his voice carefully measured as he announced the new policies. A formal review process for student complaints. A stricter oversight on how teachers graded assignments. A committee dedicated to addressing discrimination and academic fairness. It wasn't a full revolution, It wouldn't erase everything that had happened, but it was a step. Ethan sat near the back, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. They weren't doing this because they wanted to. They were doing it because they had to. And that, to him, was a victory. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and his grandfather sat on the porch, watching the fields sway with the wind. Logan rocked slowly in his chair, a pipe resting on the table beside him. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "You did something most people never have the guts to do." Ethan exhaled, watching the last slivers of sunlight disappear. "Felt like I barely did anything at all." Logan let out a low chuckle. "That's how it always feels at first." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "But you made a wave, Ethan. A small one, maybe, but sometimes, all it takes is a small wave to knock down a damn wall." Ethan glanced at his grandfather, then back at the land stretching before them. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what the old man meant. He let the thought settle, then asked, "But we're not done, are we?" Logan smiled, shaking his head. "No, kid, we're not." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs. No, they weren't done, but at least now, they had started. In the end, Ethan's battle wasn't just about a test or a teacher. It was about standing up to a system designed to keep people silent. His story proves that sometimes, the biggest changes start with one person daring to say, "This isn't right." But here's the real question. How many voices have been silenced because they thought no one would listen? What would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? Have you ever spoken up against something unfair? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if you want more eye-opening stories of truth and justice, make sure to subscribe to Covert Truths and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.